engagement in wanting to know more about gerrymandering, and you probably know more about it than many people already, just because of what all happened in Arizona the past few years, and then also what's going on currently, because even this month, there's been a lot of changes. Almost every day, the Supreme Court announces some new state that they're going to hear a case on. So I'm going to talk about some of that actually in my presentation. But anyway, I want to thank everyone here today, Ellie especially, for inviting me and getting this all set up. And what an amazing room. I feel like I'm at Microsoft's headquarters or something. So this is really fancy. So today's topics, you just had a great primer that I saw. I tend to move around, so I'll try to be close to the microphone so that I don't do that. That was a great primer. I saw that on CBS Sunday Morning when it aired, and I thought, gosh, this is a perfect intro. And so I was really glad when Ellie said that we would be seeing that today. Sorry, and to go back, we're just going to talk a little bit more about gerrymandering. I think you probably all know how it rigs elections because it's been so much in the news and a great topic lately, but we'll talk a little bit. And then talk about how Arizona's different. As you probably know, we have an independent redistricting commission, and I'm the chair of that commission until 2021, when the next chair, oh, wow. It's getting even better. Yeah, exactly. No feedback.
We're going to turn that one off.
Oh, fabulous. Is this working yet?
Yeah.
Held it pretty close.
Hello?
Yeah.
You can hear me well? Great. I love this. Like Phil Donahue or, sorry. And I do want to encourage you throughout this presentation, actually, if there's a burning question or topic you just want to raise, feel free, because I'd rather have this be a dialogue. If somebody has a question or wants to just raise something, feel free to do so. I'm happy to entertain that. Otherwise, you can ask questions at the end, too. I think we have until noon, is that correct? So we have plenty of time to get through this little agenda, but I do want to talk about how Arizona is different. And, gosh, this is amazing. This is incredible. So I forgot, I can see these. I don't have to look around. I can look at you and look at this. So today's topics, creation of the Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission, which frankly, thanks to the League of Women Voters, that's why it happened with some other groups way back when Proposition 106 was created. We'll talk about that. The process, the results from our commission, some lessons learned, and then what can we expect or what might change in 2020 for the next redistricting commission. So you already know about gerrymandering, or some say gerrymandering, because of this gentleman out in Massachusetts who redrew the lines to benefit his party. And unfortunately, he's quite an accomplished gentleman. He was actually the 5th Vice President of the United States, and of course the Governor of Massachusetts, and did all these other things on the left, but unfortunately the only thing he's remembered for is the fact that he gerrymandered, and now he's famous. And this is just a great, I think, depiction. If you need more understanding of what gerrymandering is, it's a nice graphic to explain it. If you've got a group of people, 50 people, and you need to divide them into districts, there's a bunch of ways to do that. We all know we can draw lines different ways. And when you draw those lines, people are impacted. And so on the left, the way these 50 people are, there's 60% blue and 40% red. So if you want to carve that into districts, you can draw them in vertical lines and keep all the R's together, essentially, all the blues. And you're always going to have 3 blue districts and 2 red districts. That's perfect representation. That represents the group. But you could also do it to draw them more compactly, and just change the lines and make them horizontal, and then they're compact, but they're unfair. Because then you have 5 blue districts, because there's always that many more blue than red. And then the neither compact nor fair version, which would be a gerrymander, I would say, would be to carve it up so that the red is going to win, even though they're the minority. So that's sort of just a really basic preliminary example of gerrymandering. And it's been going on since the beginning of time, and as you heard, both sides do this. It's not just a Republican thing, it's Democrats too. I come from the state of Illinois. I'm from Peoria originally, and so is my husband. He's here today, Chris. And we grew up in a red district in a blue state, and there, the Democrats do not want independent redistricting, because I've gone there to talk about it, so it's really interesting, because here, the Republicans don't want it, and because it's whoever's in power doesn't really want independent redistricting. That's just how it is. But both sides gerrymander, and it's been going on since even 1787 when Patrick Henry tried to gerrymander James Madison. There's history on this. And Congress started passing laws because they were starting to see some things around this and thought, well, we should start to create laws, but they weren't being enforced. And so now, since the 1980s, there's been a number of cases that have come before the Supreme Court. I think starting in 1986, there was a case. But let me jump back to the 60s when the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. That's when racial gerrymandering, they said, the courts were clear. They said, you cannot racially gerrymander, meaning drawing lines to discriminate against an ethnicity. So that was clear. The problem has been partisan gerrymandering. So is it okay to carve up districts based on Republicans and Democrats? And that's where it's been a little muddier. And so right now, there's agreement that it's within the court's jurisdiction, and they've heard cases, but they haven't really ruled against partisan gerrymandering yet. But there's a case currently pending, which you probably know about, in Wisconsin. That is this case, Gill versus Whitford. The hearing was October 3rd of 2017. The opinion hasn't come out yet. Everyone's waiting. But the court has before it an opportunity to essentially bless a metric called the efficiency gap. That's what the people are proposing be used by the courts to say, here's a mathematical, evidence-based approach to try to say, to determine if partisan gerrymandering has occurred. So everyone's kind of holding their breath to see, will the court actually come through this time? But you can see this, there's a lot happening right now. I mean, back in 2004, there's a case where partisan gerrymandering claims that were declared non-justiciable by the Supreme Court. Yet Justice Kennedy said, but I'm open to, if somebody can come up with a metric and show us a way to do this, I'm open to making them justiciable cases. And that's why this case in Wisconsin is so interesting right now, because everyone's looking at Justice Kennedy to see if he'll agree that this efficiency gap metric will work. We actually had our own Supreme Court case. We actually had two this past few years. You may have followed it. But one of them dealt with essentially partisan gerrymandering. We were accused of favoring Democrats and diluting Republicans by having differences in population in our legislative district map. And the court fortunately ruled unanimously in the commission's favor. So that case, they said, no, we didn't do things to favor Democrats. We actually are subject to something called the Voting Rights Act. And Arizona has a special hurdle it has to cover with passing Section 5, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And so because of that, there are certain things we have to do, and the court determined that that's what we were doing, is trying to comply with Section 5 in order to draw the maps we did. But anyway, you heard about Maryland, Texas, they didn't mention on the video, but that's also, Texas is kind of famous for it seems like there's always a redistricting battle of some kind happening. They likely will, the court is going to hear arguments this spring. They just haven't scheduled the hearing. Maryland's is scheduled for March 28th, so that'll be upcoming. And then North Carolina, the court just granted a request from the Republicans to stay the lower court's order to redraw the congressional district map. So while they do their appeal, the Republicans, they're saying, okay, you don't have to redraw the lines yet, but it'll likely end up at the Supreme Court too. So lots happening, and it's going to be a really interesting year, frankly, at the court. So this term gerrymandering.
Could you go back to North Carolina?
Yes.
I know that the lead women vote instrumental in pushing, for it to be fixed. And what does this mean? Does it mean by 2018 elections it will not be changed?
There's a gentleman named Rick Hasen, and I just read an article or an opinion by him today. He's an election law expert out of California, and he doesn't think it will be redrawn in 2018, that they won't have to do it. But you're right, the League of Women Voters is very instrumental in that North Carolina case, and maybe all of these, frankly. I mean, they're so active and always trying to ensure that fairness is distributed across our nation. So I'm not sure. Ellie?
Can you tell us a little bit about this efficiency gap metric system?
Yeah, I can't tell you a lot. I'm not a mathematician. I should have said this at the beginning too. I'm not a mathematician nor a lawyer, so I'm really dangerous in that regard. I'm just a commissioner who volunteered to serve on this commission, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But this efficiency gap metric, there's if you Google that, you will find how they actually calculate it, but it has to do with trying to figure out wasted votes in a district. So by wasted, it's kind of a bad term in that it's almost superfluous votes. There's an amount of votes that are necessary to win an election, and anything above that is considered wasted or superfluous. And so they're trying to figure out, they're trying to look at district by district how many wasted votes there were, and figure out if there's a way to tie a gerrymandering claim using that metric. But I really can't describe it very well. I don't know enough about the efficiency gap metric. We didn't use it in our commission. It was just actually being developed by a political scientist in California and a lawyer out of Chicago, and the two of them got together to come up with this metric, and then they decided, hey, maybe we can use this in the Wisconsin case on their map. So that's how this all started getting advanced, and then now it's at the Supreme Court, and then they present it there, and we'll see what they decide. Yes?
From your vantage point, is this metric accurate or fair, or do you like it?
I haven't studied it enough to have an opinion, because this is really sort of new since just the past year or so, and we were kind of already done with drawing our maps. We didn't utilize it. But you know, anything, I would be open to such a metric, it would be great, because one thing I learned as a redistricting commissioner is there's very little black and white out there. It's a lot of gray matter that you're trying to navigate, frankly. And so to the extent a metric can come forward that works, I just don't know if that one does. We'll see what the Supreme Court says, though.
Just a second.
Oh, sorry.
So what data is used to determine
Use the mic, please.
Up close, up close.
what data is used to determine the partisan population and where it resides?
Usually, so I think, you know, everybody uses different stuff. I don't know. I can only comment on what we did. And the way we actually ended up using partisan data is we looked at registration across the state in terms of R's, D's, and I's, but we also looked at past election results. And so you determine from that Republicans and Democrat turnout. We had to use it because of something I'm going to get to in a minute, competitiveness. Competitiveness is one of the criterion, and actually Arizona is the only state right now that has competitiveness as a criterion. And so you have to look at partisanship data in order to try to figure out competitiveness. But you know, some people would say, you know, oh, no partisanship should be considered at all, but we actually have to consider it. But I'm not sure what other states do in terms of looking at things, but usually past election results and voter registration data. Yes?
So
after each census,
Yep.
districts are redrawn. Is it true that they're redrawn?
Yes. Yes. So we'll talk about. We're going to get to that process. But yes, every 10 years, districts are redrawn. There's a reapportionment that happens, and they determine where is population in the United States right now, because it changes. We're a very mobile society, and so they determine how how many live in Arizona. So in 2010, it was 6.4 million people. And based on that, they determined how many representatives we get to have in Congress. And so Arizona happened to get an additional seat in 2010. So instead of drawing 8 districts, we drew 9. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. So I just want to kind of quiz the group slightly on this particular picture. And maybe some of you recognize it if you've been in Arizona a while. This is the congressional district map from the first Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission. There were 8 districts at the time that they had to draw. And what do you think of this?
It's better than some.
Yeah, better than some?
Yeah.
And do you see anything unusual? Yeah, that 2. There's a 2 here. Oh, yeah. There's a 2 up here. There's only.
Two wasn't contiguous. Was that a river?
Right, it is contiguous because you see that it's a dry wash. Yeah, someone asked if it's a river. They figured out a very creative way to connect that little island. Do you have an idea what that island is?
Hopi.
It's Hopi. It's the Hopi Reservation. So good job. You guys know your geography here. What happened is the Hopi Reservation came to the commission and said, we don't want to be in the same district with the Navajo. And that makes it really hard in that situation since they're completely surrounded.
by the Navajo.
Right, and so that's a super interesting thing. So, you know, that's a gerrymander, there's no question, but it was done for good intent. Because one of the things the commission has to consider is communities of interest. The Hopi Reservation is a community of interest, so is the Navajo Reservation. And so you kind of want to honor and respect people's communities of interest and do what you can to keep them whole. And they made a case that they really didn't want to be with them for whatever reason. They weren't getting along. Fortunately, I will say that when our commission came along, the Hopi were okay with being back with the Navajo. So we didn't have to do this, but we probably would have too, because that's kind of what redistricting is about. So when you hear the term gerrymander, you can't automatically assume this is really bad, because the term does get thrown around a lot, and I know it's counter to what you think, because you always hear gerrymandering equals bad, essentially. But there are times where you gerrymander to help a community of interest, for instance. It's not necessarily a partisan gerrymander, and it's certainly not a racial gerrymander, but it's definitely a manipulation of lines. So just wanted to point that out because I think it's a really interesting map. So back in 2011, Cokie Roberts and her husband Steve had a column, and maybe they still do. It's syndicated in some papers nationally. And I just loved this phrase. She was talking about the Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission. And she said, in a spasm of good sense. And I love that because it's just a great term. And essentially, you know, we passed independent redistricting in this state. We were pioneers, really, back in 2000. I didn't live in Arizona then. I was still in Illinois. And Prop 106 came before the voters. Fortunately, Arizona has the ability to bring citizens' initiatives forward and bring legislation forward that can be voted on. And that's kind of amazing. And there are some states, mostly Western, that can do that. But Arizona's one of them. And a group of citizens, mainly led by the League of Women Voters and Common Cause and good government groups, got banded together and got some language in front of voters, and they passed it with 56% of the vote. And I think the legislature was pretty surprised when this happened. But it was this combination of champions, and they conducted a poll to determine what do people really want. Maybe some of you filled out that survey. It's called Let the People Draw the Lines, and they collected over 235,000 signatures and got it on the ballot, and Prop 106 is passed. So at that point, the Arizona Constitution was amended to reflect that now the power of redrawing lines is going to be taken away from the legislature and given to an independent redistricting commission. These 3 people were instrumental in that. I don't know does anyone know any of them? So the gentleman in the back is Bart Turner, Republican, and the man on the right is Dennis Burke, and he's a Democrat from Common Cause. and Ann Essinger.
She just passed away.
Exactly, and so kind of this is in her honor today. Ann Essinger was the president, I understand, of the League of Women Voters back at that time. Huge force in making this happen, and considered an independent for this. So there was a Republican, a Democrat, and an independent who kind of came together to provide the leadership to ensure that independent redistricting could become a reality. And I think that's one of the reasons for its success, is it's rooted in this multi-partisan effort. And I think it's really cool. And unfortunately, Ann Essinger, I never got to meet her, but she just passed this week. And so this is in her honor. I'm sure she'd be delighted that this many League of Women Voters people came out on a Saturday to hear about gerrymandering. But this is the language people voted on back then. And you'll notice, ending the practice of gerrymandering and improving voter and candidate participations, which I think both, great goals, by creating an independent commission of balanced appointments to oversee, and this is the key, the mapping of fair and competitive districts. So that was the preamble of this whole Prop 106. So we're to oversee the mapping of fair and competitive districts. That word competitive is a really important one to remember. So we're special because we're one of the few states, as Ellie mentioned, that has independent redistricting, but also because we also have that competitiveness criterion. So we'll talk about that. We have a recipe that we have to follow, so to speak. We can't just go in and start drawing lines however we want to draw them. The Constitution outlines the criteria that we have to consider. So the first two are whatever every redistrictor everywhere has to comply with, and that's the US Constitution and the Voting Rights Act. And equal population. So I mentioned 6.4 million people in Arizona at the time of the 2010 census. This is math I can do. You take that number and you divide by 9, because we have to draw 9 districts. They said, Arizona, because of your population growth since the last decade, we're giving you an additional congressional seat to represent you. So we divide that number by 9. So you come up with an ideal population number. That number is 710,000 and something for congressional districts. So that means every congressional district has to have 710,224, I think is the number, or something like that, in those districts. And to the person, you have to divide it up. So Arizona's people, as was pointed out in the video, well, with the Pennsylvania map, they're not distributed equally. No state has that. So you got to figure out, how do you get 710,000 people in a rural area? Well, you end up drawing really big districts. And I loved that David brought the cutout of your district right now. I know it's not pretty.
That's 4.
Yeah, that's 4.
Number 4.
And CD1 is, I told him CD1's
Yeah.
even bigger, so
It's always a
even-
question which way to do it.
It's even more territory that would have to be covered over there. But anyway, let me get to the rest of the criteria. The rest are standard redistricting criteria. Yes?
Yeah, my question is, the number of people, are they counting children, or are they counting voters? What
Yeah,
are they counting?
population. So yes, everybody that, when you fill out the census, every household's required to fill out the census, whether they do or not. The census is not a perfect tool, as we all know, and the results are out of date instantly but that's the best we have. So we use the results of the census, and all those
And
questions that get answered on that are
That
what
also
determine.
doesn't have to do with the party
Right,
that you belong to?
not at all. Nope, just straight count of people. Oh, another question? You want to wait till the...
Can we go to Bill, and then we'll go here, and then we'll maybe...
Oh, sure. I'm sorry, I didn't see that.
You can't be serious. It has to be exactly,
I know.
that's insane.
I know, but there are computers.
Oh.
So,
I know, but I think that lends to gerrymandering.
Well, it does. That's exactly right. So, yes.
And does this count prison populations as well?
Yes, so they are counted. And that's a topic that may change in the future. It's definitely different states are trying to pass legislation. This has to do with prison populations, because in some areas there are large prisons, and how do you count those people? they are counted, and it's contentious in terms of how they're going forward. There may be some states that pass legislation saying they shouldn't be counted, but right now they're all counted. So, but that's a great question because it's definitely
Students too?
yes, and students, yeah. Yeah, that is also something that some people, and there may be some states that have legislation regarding that, I'm not sure. Yes,
Is it all institutions are counted, including colleges with transitory student
yes,
population?
yeah, the student populations are counted if they're registered to vote in the state that they're in.
Well, that's different than registered voters. Population number includes the population of ASU?
I don't think so. I don't know. Does anyone know in the room about whether like the population of the college at ASU would be included?
I can Google it.
Yeah, please do. That would be interesting to know. I'm just not sure. 'Cause I was thinking it was based on if the student is registered to vote in the state of Arizona, but they're gonna be, so I don't think they are then in that
Well, if
case.
it's a census, they probably are. Because
If
the
they lived
census
in
gets them.
Arizona,
Yeah,
right, if
exactly.
they were counted, if they filled out, when, their parents are, if they are head of household and they filled out the census in
Arizona
2010, right, then, and they're going to an in-state school, then they would definitely be in that population. But I think if a student is coming from New Jersey or something to ASU, I don't think they wouldn't have been counted in that census, and so, they wouldn't be factored in to the
Well, they
equation.
probably would if they have an apartment in Tempe someplace.
Yeah,
And the census comes in the mail, they just count.
yeah. Well, this is where the census isn't exactly a perfect tool, because whether they filled that out at their temporary location in Arizona or not and turned it in, I don't know, frankly. Yes. Lady with the hat?
How can that be competitive when you look at populations like here in Prescott, where there's so many more adults because it's a retirement community, and then maybe in agrarian places where there are more children? Certainly that isn't competitive in terms of voting power.
You have to repeat the question.
Right, so we'll talk about, everybody gets counted because everybody gets represented. That's how the census works, and, all the population is counted. But all those people can't vote, obviously. So when we're doing, we'll get to how we get to the data behind that, but we're looking at voting age population when we're drawing these districts, so, yes.
Are we only speaking to federal elections today?
No, we'll cover the legislative district map too.
Okay.
Yeah, and if you'll wait for me to come around, we can all hear the questions, and this is just gonna be great for my steps today. Thank you.
Yes.
In states that have taken away prisoners' voting rights, what is the effect of this disenfranchisement on the process?
I don't have an answer.
They can't vote. How does that work?
I don't have an answer. That's a tricky one. I know, it's an excellent point. I don't know. Right.
Well, they're underage. I'm talking about an aged population that has been deprived the right to vote.
Yeah, and the re-enfranchisement of prisoners.
Well, to answer that question, the people in prison come from all over the state, so they might not necessarily live in that district anyway. So I think that if they were allowed to vote, it would be really tricky because, like somebody from Prescott that gets sentenced to prison ends up going to Phoenix, to a different district, so.
Yeah.
Okay, this is 210.
Oh, good. Thank you for
But I
Googling.
can see where you're confused. Their criteria was 1, 2, 3. They said, live or stay at the residence most of the time, or stayed there on April 1st, 2010, and had no permanent place to live, or stays at the residence more time than any other place. Then they changed it, they put a question in asking the student where they spent the most time.
Wow, that's in the census?
Yes.
Hmm.
So
Thank you.
I think your not knowing was legitimate.
Thanks. I'm still confused, but yeah. Goodness gracious. Yeah, I didn't know that the census actually asked that, so that's good to know. Okay, so, let me just mention, the rest of these criteria, notice the language to the extent practicable. So there's wiggle room, there's decisions that get made, that you try to do the best you can and weigh all of these criteria equally. That's the point, is they all have to be considered, and to the extent you weigh them equally, that's what you're supposed to do. So each of the commissioners is looking at all of these criteria and weighing them equally, and competitiveness is considered an equal criteria to all the other traditional redistricting criteria you see. So Voting Rights Act, you don't need to read through all this language, but it's we all have to comply with it, every state, of course. It was passed in 1965, but there's a special section called Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and that deals with something called pre-clearance. And that means any state that has been deemed as having had discriminatory practices in its voting in the past is kind of in a penalty box. And unfortunately, Arizona was in the penalty box and has been. And we're only one of 9 states that's covered fully, meaning the whole state is covered. All counties have to comply. And it means that all the district lines that our commission draws, and the legislature had to do it too when they were in charge, have to go to the Department of Justice or a federal court to have the lines approved before they can go into effect. So that's what we had to do. So we knew going into this, we have to pass Section 5 or pre-clearance. The redistricting plans cannot be retrogressive. That's a legal term that's used throughout this whole thing, and it just means they can't be weakened in any way. So this means we do draw majority-minority districts so that minority voters have the opportunity to elect the candidate of their choice. And you determine whether or not there's been retrogression by doing a bunch of analysis. So our commission retained a bunch of consultants and legal people to help us determine, are the lines we're drawing going to retrogress or weaken any minority voters? And once all of this analysis is done, then we can determine, okay, we're happy with our maps and we're gonna go ahead and submit them to the Department of Justice. And then they decide, they have 60 days or something from the time the maps are done. So there's always this clock ticking throughout this process, because we know, the elections have to occur and the poor county people need their precinct lines so they can conduct elections. And then we have to have DOJ pre-clear everything in advance. So it really is a condensed timeline to get all this done. And so it's just another hurdle that we have to go through. I can't remember if I have a slide right now on what happened though. So in 2013, there is there was a Supreme Court case called Shelby County versus Holder. And effectively what that case did is it gutted Section 5. Because right now Section 5, which is this thing that we had to comply with, is no longer enforceable. So based on that Supreme Court decision. So what's going to be super interesting is what does that mean for the next commission? Because they won't have to comply with this. Do they still have to draw majority and minority districts? Well, they still have to comply with the Voting Rights Act. But how this is going to play out in the next decade of redistricting is like everyone's guessing and not sure what will happen. It's a very interesting topic and one that you're going to probably be hearing more about. Yes?
Just a question in terms of, is this only congressional or does it also include our state legislative boundaries?
Great question. It applies to both maps. So I'm just going to mention the competitiveness criterion again, because we're the only state, again, that has that criterion. And I love that quote, "The magic of democracy is rooted in competition." So I'm a post-partisan, reformed partisan, I guess I'd say. I'm an independent voter, so I'm unaffiliated with either party. I happen to really value competitiveness. I like it. I like to see an even playing field. I like the voters to feel like their vote matters and that it matters if they come out and vote, because there's an opportunity here for the R or the D or the I to win. And that the district isn't drawn in such a way that it's lopsided. So I happen to value it, so I like that quote, and since I'm giving the presentation, I'm going to say that. Okay, yes?
What was the reason why they gutted 5 Supreme Court? And was it, do you know what the vote was, and what was the vote on party lines?
I think it was a 5-4 vote. Does anyone remember? It was very contentious, and Kennedy ended up siding with the Republicans on that one, the conservatives, I should say. It was based on the fact that Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act is what determines which states are in the penalty box, so to speak. Shouldn't use that word really, but that's the best way to describe it. And it's a mathematical formula that hadn't been updated since the Voting Rights Act had been enacted in 1965. And so plaintiffs said, this formula isn't fair anymore. We've made a lot of progress as a nation since 1965. And discrimination isn't happening, essentially. I mean, that's kind of the bottom line. And so they said, so the court said, well, okay, yeah, we can see how, yes, this formula hasn't been updated. There probably are still some problems out there, but yeah, we do agree things have gotten better. And so ultimately the majority said, until Congress, they kind of punted it, and they said, here, Congress, you fix Section 4. You determine the new mathematical formula that determines who's going to be subject to Section 5. And everybody rubbed their hands, because everybody knows that that is not going to happen anytime soon, because Congress is not going to address this issue. So essentially, Section 5 could be, brought back to life if Section 4 is ever dealt with, but it's a tall order. So most people think that it just, for now, at least is done. So we'll see. So we have this great independent redistricting commission here in Arizona. Was anyone here in 2000 to vote on Prop 106? Great, a number of you. Pretty good. I wasn't, as I mentioned earlier. I didn't live in Arizona at the time. But there's 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and an independent. And that independent can be from the Green Party, the Libertarian Party, whatever party. They just can't be a Republican or a Democrat. And so the way it's set up, and this is all prescribed in the Arizona Constitution that was part of Prop 106, majority and minority leadership pick the Republicans and the Democrats. That's how it's laid out. And then those 4 pick the chair. Anybody can apply to be on the commission. And this is a plug for all of you to start thinking about applying, or have your friends or people you know who want to be more civically engaged apply for the next round of redistricting, because there are some rules. You can't have been in elected office, so maybe David can't do it if he gets elected, but and you can't have served as a lobbyist, but it's all outlined. And you have to have been in your party for, I think, 3 years. So you can't just flip over to become an independent or whatever, but there are some criteria surrounding who's eligible. But then after that, you fill out an application. Last time, the way it was handled, the Commission on Appellate Court Appointments is the one that does the vetting of all those applications and determines a slate for the majority and minority leadership to pick from a qualified group of 10. So there's 10 Republicans, 10 Democrats that majority and minority leadership get to pick from. And then they come up, the Commission on Appellate Court Appointments also comes up with 5 independent candidates that the 4 commissioners will choose. So that's just how it's done. Now that could change. There's currently legislation that's been proposed this term to modify the Independent Redistricting Commission. We'll see what happens. But if that would end up having to be voted on by the citizens, so we'll see.
Does it take
how far it
amending
goes.
the Constitution as well?
Does it what?
Will it take amending the Constitution
Yes.
as well?
Yeah, it would have to. So the legislation, if it passed, then the Constitution would be amended to reflect that new legislation. So we'll talk about what some of those changes might be towards the end. Because I actually, there's some that I think, you know, it could stand to be improved. There's a big process then, oh yes, sorry.
So I noticed the commissioners are all from Pima and Maricopa County. Is that just a coincidence?
It is a coincidence, and that's another plug for getting you Yavapai County folks to get your friends to fill out an application. Because I actually, when I reread our 2 hearing transcripts before coming here, and wanted to refresh my memory of what people were telling us back then, and we had done, one of our public information officer had done some research to determine how many had applied from Yavapai County, and only 1 person applied to be on the commission. So we'd love to see more representation from counties outside of Maricopa and Pima. I mean, that would be ideal. And this lady is right. I mean, there were, 3 from Pima County, me being one of them, and 2 from Maricopa. So, yes.
So with this redistricting commission, is it like Congress? Do people stay on it until they die?
Yes, we're appointed for 10-year terms, so it's definitely a long gig, and it's volunteer. We're not paid, so this is it's a long time to have the role. But essentially, like right now, for instance, our last commission meeting was July of this year, so we're done. Our lines are done. We've won all the litigation and it's over. And so redistricting is done for this decade. So we won't meet anymore and there's no more time commitment. But I'm still the chair until 2024, unless I get removed or something. But I don't think anyone's after me right now. Yes.
I was wondering, when you say people who are not in elective or have not been in elective office.
Yes.
A lot of people in here are probably either Democrat or Republican precinct committee people. Do precinct committee people?
Great question. I'm not sure if a precinct committee person is eligible or not. I didn't happen to be one, so it didn't come up, but I don't know. Maybe you could check out You could Google it. Because it says it in the Prop 106 language, the kinds of people, and it would be interesting to point that out, because I would love it if you would all go out and evangelize to get more people to apply. So before drawing a single line, so the commission is formed back in March of 2011. We have 5 members at that point, and essentially we're starting up a new state agency, and we are the equivalent of the legislature for this task. So it's an actual, body, an agency, and there was a lot of administrative stuff. We had to get a staff
Did you have
hired.
to meet in secret?
Yes. Yes, there were many charges of meeting in secret and all of that. No, there are all kinds of rules surrounding our meetings. No business, you cannot have a quorum of commissioners. And with 5 people, a quorum equals 3. So 3 people cannot be meeting out, getting together outside of a meeting. Really, nobody should, frankly, but people, talk and get together, but you can't have 3 commissioners together. And our lawyers were very observant of this, because one of them had served on the open meeting law evaluation team, Mary O'Grady, and she's very knowledgeable on all open meeting law requirements. And while the commission, there isn't language in the Constitution that says we're subject to the open meeting law statutes, there's an openness criteria in that it provides information on notice, for instance, like how much notice we have to give, and that we can't have a quorum of commissioners meet outside of a public meeting, and that any decisions have to be made in public and voted on. So there's a bunch of rules surrounding openness, which is a good thing. That was the whole reason, the Independent Redistricting Commission kind of came about, was the idea to bring this process out into the public and let the public participate and see what's happening and hear what's happening and be able to contribute. And so, it makes sense that there's an openness requirement. Yes?
Are all the meetings held in Phoenix?
No, we held them all over the state. So this is part of our first round hearings. We went out actually everywhere, including Prescott, to let people tell us what those definitions of the criteria mean. So, because we had no preconceived notions of, competitiveness means straight up 50-50, or a community of interest is Native American reservation, and it's also a retirement community, and it's also XYZ. So we went out to the public and didn't draw any lines. We hadn't drawn anything. We just did a listening tour and let people tell us, okay, define your communities of interest. Anybody could come up, and you can watch these hearings still. They're online to this day on our site, azredistricting.org. We transcribed all of our meetings, all of our hearings, and also videotaped them so that anybody could participate. And people who couldn't make a meeting could still submit their input. We tried to make it very accessible for everybody. It was really useful to do that, to go out and hear what people had to say, because we heard all kinds of definitions of communities of interest, and it helped us when we were then going to draw the maps to know, oh yeah, I remember in Flagstaff they said XYZ. These, flood communities, for instance, floodplain communities, things that we hadn't considered before. So it was really an interesting and educational thing for all the commissioners. Yes?
To your question.
Again, according to my friend Google.
Good, thank you.
It said the Constitution also specifies within the 3 years previous to appointment, members shall not have been appointed to, elected to, or a candidate for any other public office, including precinct committee women or committee men, but not including school board members or officers, and shall not have served as an officer of a political party or served as a registered paid lobbyist, blah, blah, blah.
Thank you. So unfortunately, precinct committee men and women are not eligible, but at least if they were 3 years prior to that. But if you were in your past, and you could. So there are rules around it, which is a good thing, I think. But you should review those and then try to find people who are eligible to apply from Yavapai County, because it would be great to have more diversity on the commission, geographic diversity. We traveled all over the state. Our staff calculated this for us, so supposedly it was 29,000 miles. It's a big state, as you all know. Lots of ground to cover. And this was some of the ways the public could engage. We had a website where there was just a lot of different information posted all the time. Whenever we were coming up with a new draft of a map, we would post what that map looked like, and people could pull down the maps, review them. You could submit public comment online that came to us. People submitted sections of maps. They would submit, not a fully fledged Arizona map, but maybe a chunk of, wherever they happen to live, telling us why they thought that a certain group had to be kept together or whatever. So it was very interactive and useful. Yes. It is.
Good.
So we had the great fortune, I should mention that, good eye. Sandra Day O'Connor came to one of our meetings in the City of Phoenix Council Chambers, I think that was. And she came to our meeting and provided public comment, and it was lovely to meet her. I had never met her, so it's great. That's one of the benefits of serving on a commission like this. You get to meet people all over this state, and also traveling through this beautiful state, just to go to these communities and get to meet the people. It was the best part of it. So there's a whole process that's outlined in the Arizona Constitution. A key thing, and it came up in that video that you saw with Mo Rocca, incumbent protection. So incumbent protection is not what we're here to do. So it's explicitly excluded. In fact, we cannot consider where incumbents live when we're drawing our lines. So starting with a clean slate, and it says that in the language, and that's the reason for that language. We're not starting from the old map, the map the last commission drew. For one thing, we have more population now, so we had to draw an additional district, and then also there was something else around that. Anyway, we had to draw 9 districts. So we start with a clean slate. We don't consider incumbent addresses, and then divide the state into a grid map. And this is actually all prescribed. It's, again, a recipe that is outlined in the Constitution, and we just followed it. I should mention here that we hired, and same with the last commission, we hired a lot of technical assistance, both legal advice. We had legal counsel for both Republicans and Democrats, which I frankly was opposed to. I wanted one one lawyer that represents, because they represent all 5 of us, whether they're partisan lawyers or not, they have to represent all of us, and I'm part of the mix. And so I thought it would make sense to have one lawyer, but I was outvoted by my 4 fellow commissioners. And so we had, just like the last commission did it that way too, a Republican and a Democratic counsel, but frankly, they were both wonderful to work with and frankly nonpartisan to my mind. They both have great bipartisan track records, which is why they ended up getting the job, frankly. And then we hired a mapping consultant, and the mapping consultant does all this drawing of the maps in public session. The commissioners could go to the mapping consultant and explore things offline with them outside of a public meeting, for instance. They can go meet with the mapping consultant and say, hey, can you draw this? I want to explore whether drawing the line this way, what does that do to our numbers in terms of population, in terms of competitiveness, in terms of all the criterion? What does it do? So people could do that, and that's the purpose of the mapping consultant. The mapping consultant doesn't draw the maps, though. The commissioners do. They tell the mapping consultant what they want to see, and if you watch any of the videos of our hearings online, if you're really curious about this, you can see what we did. And so that was the whole point, is the public could participate in that as well. Yes?
Yeah, I have a question. What is your budget?
So that's, it was $6 million for the first commission. And that's something that Proposition 106 didn't handle in the best way, because it says the commission shall be granted $6 million at the beginning. I don't know what the first commission ended up spending, because what happens is there are lawsuits that get filed and a lot of money gets spent. But essentially the state legislature appropriated $6 million, and then I'm sure they spent all of that. I don't know what the first commission ended up with, but essentially we start out and we have nothing, and there was a question, well, what, did we get $6 million too? Because now we're the new commission and we're starting over. And the legislature said, no, we don't know. Well, so they said, come up with a budget, I think, and that's how we just said, okay, well, we think we probably need $6 million, since the last commission went through their entire $6 million. We were sure we'll have litigation too. And they said, no, we'll give you $2 million. I think that was the initial start. So we take that, but we ended up having to go back to the legislature numerous times to request money, because they're required to fund us, but they made it difficult, we'll say it that way. So our executive director, Ray Bladine, whom some of you may know of through this, he ended up being the one going to the legislature with hat in hand each time to say, okay, well, we're out of money. And it was kind of interesting, because, the legislature is suing the commission, and so we had to pay for defense. And they're the ones giving us the money to pay for our defense. It was crazy, and it's really a waste of taxpayer dollars, I have to say. It's sad. But that, unfortunately, independent redistricting does not take contentiousness out of redistricting. You still are going to have lawsuits, and unfortunately, that's the way our society is these days. So, but it's a great question, because same thing for next time. I don't know what they'll give them to start with, and I don't know what our commission has spent to date. We ended up finishing earlier, which was great, and we also got our maps pre-cleared on the first try, both maps, which is the first time that had ever happened in Arizona. And so that meant less time and money spent meeting and going back and changing the lines and all of that. So it was really great, but we got sued. We had 3 major lawsuits plus some other stuff that I'll cover in a little bit. Yes?
Since our government right now is all held by one party, have you had any indicators or any feelings that the independent council commissions in the 6 states will be threatened in any way?
There was a big chance they would have been threatened in the lawsuit that happened in 2015, where the legislature sued the Independent Redistricting Commission in our state. That went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. We were fortunately victorious. It was a 5-4 decision, very contentious. And that claim was whether or not the Independent Redistricting Commission is constitutional at all. And so the legislature brought this case, and they were successful getting it all the way to the Supreme Court to decide. that would have impacted every independent commission, plus a bunch of other, anything that falls under the purview of what's called the election clause of the US Constitution, where the times, places, and manners of election shall be determined by the legislature of the state thereof. And that's what the plaintiffs argued, is the legislature said, well, see here, it says the legislature gets to determine this, so we should have power over redistricting, at least when it comes to congressional districts, because it's in the US Constitution. And the California had just passed independent redistricting 10 years after Arizona, so they were watching this very closely and holding their breath, because if the court had ruled against us, there would be no more independent redistricting for congressional lines, at least. Maybe legislature, but not congressional. So it was a really important decision that a lot of states were watching, and like 14 amicus briefs were filed, meaning friend of the court briefs on our side, saying, and what was really neat about those amicus briefs is they came from both Republicans and Democrats. There were a lot of Republicans in California who said, we believe in independent redistricting, it's a good thing, and if a citizens initiative brought it forward, then it should stand. I mean, this was something the voters voted on, and they wanted it, and so they should get to have it. And fortunately, by the skin of our teeth, I think, we ended up prevailing. And so independent redistricting, what's great about that, frankly, is that now it's solidified. It's something now that all states can use if they can get it to the ballot. I mean, not all states have citizens initiatives, so it's not necessarily sure that there'll be independent redistricting in the state, but at least it remains as a possibility for states that can do it. And so a lot of states actually now are toying with the idea of having independent redistricting and trying to take that responsibility away from the legislature because they want to have it. So that was a really important case.
How are the commissioners protected against litigation?
Yes, so we are essentially legislators for the purpose of redistricting. So we have what's called legislative immunity. So we can't be sued individually for something. The commission gets sued as a whole, but we're not personally liable. There's protections because of legislative immunity. I'm grateful for that.
Yeah.
Goodness. Yeah.
I hear you talking about the competitiveness and the party influence in both the makeup of the commission and everything else. And I see this continuing trend in Arizona for people who don't register they register without a party. And the numbers seem to be growing to the point where that may end up being bigger in either Republicans or Democrats.
It's already happened.
And how is that likely to affect the whole process of who's on the commission and how the map gets drawn under the competitive question?
It's a great question. So back when Prop 106 was passed, the independent block, the independent registration in the state was 18%. It's now 35%. That's huge. And so to me, as one of those independents, I would really like to see some changes made to the composition of the commission. I'd like to see, for one, a larger commission and have it 9 with 3, 3, and 3, so that it's pretty much evenly split among the parties. I think that would be a fair approach. I understand a lot of people are like, oh, having 9 people is going to be way too many and it's too hard administratively, but I think to the extent possible, the commission should reflect the composition of the state, and that applies to partisanship as well. So RD and I think that would be great. I think it needs to be an odd number of people too, so that votes can be broken, there won't be ties, and then and whether we have some kind of requirement in there for geographic diversity, I think would also is interesting. I don't know how you'd actually make that happen, but I would like to see it happen. I just would hope that more people apply from some of the rural counties. so that it's more likely of a reality. But it's a great question, and so the legislature actually right now has some legislation they've proposed to change the composition of the commission, but they're suggesting it be 8 people. And they have some various rules that, like, at least, don't quote me because I don't know, I haven't read all the legislation, but I think it's like a certain number would be for Maricopa County, like at least half, things like that. So there's definitely some potentially suspicious things in there. But that's why what's great is at least the voters will have an opportunity, if this does pass and they're successful in getting something on the ballot, that at least I hope voters will be able to see through any kinds of, and I'm not saying they're going to do anything nefarious, but they definitely are not fans of the Independent Redistricting Commission, and they'd like to take that power back to the
So
extent
if
they
I
can.
understand, you have Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, Green. Is independent also determined as a party in that way, or is it just 4 parties you look at?
So there's the way the Constitution says it's a Republican, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and an independent. But the independent can be unaffiliated, Green Party, Libertarian. They can be anything except Republican or Democrat. So it's a wide variety of definition.
On that point, I would concur with your 9.
Hang on.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, the mic, sorry.
I want to hear.
Jogging today, we're
No,
jogging.
oh, yeah.
I should have given that.
No, on that point, I really agree with your proposal for 9, because I really don't see how a Green or Libertarian really represents the mass of independents. I don't see that.
Yeah, and you're right. Because if you look at the voter registration numbers, and actually new ones just got posted on the Secretary of State's website yesterday, I looked them up. The way it's broken out on their site, it's Green, Libertarian, and Other. And so Other is the big one, it's very large. And then the Green and Libertarian are very small. But for the purposes of this commission, an independent is considered a Green, a Libertarian, or Other. So there's just a big process we go through. We went out on that listening tour, came back armed with a lot more information than we had before, and then started with a clean slate and started to draw lines based on the grid map, which just is required in the Constitution, and that's just dividing the state up based on population. It doesn't take into account all those other criterion that we talked about already. So we adopt the grid maps, and then we met a bunch to start to adjust the lines according to all those other criterion. And those are the things that you can pull up online if you're curious on how the process went. And then we approved draft maps, because one of the things the Constitution requires is you have to approve a draft map and then you take it on the road again. So we came back out, and that's when I was here last time, was October of 2011. And we presented our draft map, and everybody tells us everything we did wrong, and there's a lot of yelling, and there's some people who are supportive, but it's good, because frankly it makes the maps better, because you do learn things through that process that are necessary, frankly, to make a good map. So we did that all over the state, went on the second round of hearings, and then adopted final maps, came back after the tour, made adjustments, and then adopted final maps. Passed those October 3rd and October 10th for the legislative map. So just to do this visually, you start with a clean slate. You carve up the state into equal population. That's what it looked like, the congressional map. And then you can see it looks a lot different from when you just carve it up based on population. It's very compact and everything. And you can see most of the districts, of course, are in Maricopa County, because that's where 3.5 million people live in our 6.4 million state, at least back in 2010. So that was our congressional draft map that we approved and sent to the Justice Department with all of our analysis. And it features 2 majority-minority districts to comply with Section 5, and that's what the last map had too. We had 2, so we can't retrogress. We have to have that same number again. There's 2 predominantly rural districts, which we were kind of proud of, frankly, because not having a rural representation on the commission made us, I think, even more sensitive to rural as a community of interest, because I do think there are special needs associated with rural communities. It's a different thing than what people are dealing with in Metro Phoenix. So to the extent possible, we did have 2 rural districts, which was great. And again, if you remember, 710,000 people per district. So in rural areas, that's why these people complained and said, you know, those districts are way too big. This was the draft map. I'll just jump forward here. I can't do that yet. We'll talk about that in a minute. I'll just, this was the draft map, but people complained about the size of the district. They said, these are sprawling. Sprawling is the word that's always used to describe CD1, the district on the east, that big blue area. And it is sprawling, it's huge. And that's because there's a lot of rural people spread out all over that area. But it has to have the same number as that little District 7 you see in the middle of Metro Phoenix, or 9. So we went long distances, but got the right number of people in the district, and it's a very rural district, and same for the one to the west. So that's it for that. Was our draft map? Yes.
District, I couldn't
Oh,
read
sorry.
what it was. The pink one on the bottom, right? The southeast district. What is that?
That's 2. That was 2 in the draft map. It doesn't look like that now.
And it has as much population as the blue?
Yep.
And it has Tucson.
Yep.
What's
Isn't that amazing?
Tucson?
Tucson.
Yeah.
Is that Sierra Vista and Tucson? No.
Yeah, Sierra Vista. That's so part of Cochise County is, you see that little bump. There's a like a little block. I think that's Douglas down there. There's part of Cochise County. This was one of the things we heard when we went on that second round of tour. Cochise County they came out with pitchforks and were yelling at us, and they said, keep our county whole. We don't want this broken up the way you guys have it here. That's one of the things we changed back, was we made Cochise County whole again. We adjusted things to.
What about Sedona? It was split before. Is it now?
I can't remember how Sedona is, if it's split.
All of Sedona is in District 1.
Okay, so all of it's in there. It's hard to tell from these maps.
Yeah,
We'd need to.
I can't read the words.
Yeah. This doesn't show up on the town, but anyway.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, and that's just the draft map anyway. So, this is where we had just finished this. You know, we were in the process of getting input from everybody. It's October, late October. I was here October 17th at the hearing in Prescott. Does anybody in the room know what independent means in the term Arizona? We're called the Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission. Anybody have? Independent of party.
Independent of legislature.
Yeah. It's actually independent of legislature, but a lot of people think exactly what you said, that we were supposed to be nonpartisan and take politics out of the process. Unfortunately, I don't think that's possible. It's my own personal take, but it's an inherently political process, what we're doing, redistricting, carving up states into voting districts. It's political. And the great thing about independent redistricting, what it can do is bring it out into the public, get more public participation and input, but it can't take politics out of the process, especially when you look at how, we're comprised, majority and minority leadership choose 80% of the commission. So right there, and those commissioners can vote however they want. They don't have to vote based on their Democratic or Republican leanings. They're free, agents in that regard. But it's pretty hard to take politics out of it. Let's put it that way. So we though got a lot of heat, and a lot of people, you may have followed some of it, but we were accused of bias, me especially, but everybody, that the commission can't be trusted, because I am always voting with the Democrats, and that means I'm a Democrat in sheep's clothing. So at the time, there were 21 Republican state senators and 9 Democratic ones. They had a super majority in the state Senate. So in the Constitution, there are provisions to remove commissioners, which makes sense because there should be. I mean, there's reasons laid out, and those reasons are listed: substantial neglect of duty, gross misconduct in office, inability to discharge the duties of office. So all through that summer when we're drawing the lines and the draft map went out, and we could hear the war drums, at least I could, and there were definitely people coming to our hearings and accusing me of bias and everything. And so at some point in late October, we were given a letter, each of the 5 commissioners, by Governor Brewer, that charged us with a lot of things. They said why she wasn't happy with the redistricting process. And we had a chance to respond, because it's required that we can write a letter back and address the charges. So that's what each of us did. And the letters were due October 31st. We got the letter from her the 26th of October. We replied the 31st by 8 a.m. And then on November 1st, she called a special session to remove me. And, and she had decided she had read the letter and didn't like my responses, and said that, and she essentially charged me with all 3 of those. Like it was, I think it was just a way to maximize her chances that I would be removed. It was like a combo platter of things I did wrong. So the Arizona Republic ran this cartoon, which I thought was pretty great. I guess that's me. And the same necklace on the scarf. It was pretty great. Steve Benson, give him credit for drawing that. And you know, the Arizona Republic is a Republican-oriented editorial board, but they were extremely supportive and fair to us. They tried to write editorials and warn the governor, because they had heard that she would be calling a special session, and they said, this isn't what the people wanted. This is exactly the opposite. And so please, you know, don't remove anybody, all of that. But she went ahead and did it anyway. So I then decided I was not going to let it stand, and fought back, and fortunately was represented well, first of all, we went to the Supreme Court for relief, and the Arizona Supreme Court, and said, please, will you hear our case? And we weren't sure they would take it, because they could have said, this is a political question, we're not getting involved. Hands off. But instead, they said, no, you should, this warrants a hearing, because it doesn't seem like it was very fair in terms of the due process involved. So we'll hear the case. And so so I was removed November 1st, and the stage went dark for 3 weeks until the court actually had the hearing. And within a couple hours of the hearing, they had reinstated me, which was a huge relief. I was represented by the former Chief Justice of the Arizona Supreme Court, a man named Tom Zlackett, and just, it was phenomenal. You know, it was a huge, and I think the League of Women Voters actually wrote an amicus brief. So thanks, because I wouldn't probably be here if I didn't have the support of people like you guys in the room. So that was big, and then we got back to work. It was great. It was a big bump in the road, but we got back to work, finished adjusting the lines based on what we heard in the second round of hearings, and then passed pre-clearance, both maps, April 9th and the 26th. And that was huge. As I mentioned, it's the first time that's ever happened in Arizona's history. That's what the letter looks like when it comes. It's a pretty exciting moment. And we then could have final maps. So these are what the final maps look like. You can see Cochise County is whole again, and that pink one down there is mostly Tucson, but actually 3 districts touch Metro Tucson, the blue and that yellow one. So I happen to think more representation is better. I like having multiple representatives in my area. I think it helps, but not everybody feels that way, but that's just a personal thing. Yes?
So going back to the Supreme Court case, does that offer protection going forward? Did the
Good
legislature
question.
learn, or the governor learn a lesson?
Good question. I don't know if there's language in there. I would hope so, but I mean, I don't know if there's anything in there that can prevent them attempting to remove somebody again, but I'm sure that people will try, but yeah, it was a good moment. I'm a fan of having a third branch of government, I will say that. So this was what our final map looked like. So essentially what we drew based on the numbers at that time, 4 Republican districts that are safe. As I've mentioned, if I could draw 9 competitive districts, I would like that. I know you have to do things to the extent practicable. You can't gerrymander galore just to try to make a competitive playing field everywhere. It's not reality. So I appreciate that, but I'm not a fan of safe seats. I think voters win when you have a competitive district because your vote matters, and it's more likely that you're going to have better candidates who have to go, like that Representative Bloom mentioned. I love that from Iowa on the video. He's a Tea Party Republican, but he understands. You have to listen. He's in a district where you have to listen to both sides. It's competitive districts that create that environment, and I think that's a good thing. But so we have also 2 majority-minority districts, as I mentioned. We don't split Native American Indian reservations. There are, I think, 21 reservations in the state, a lot. So anyway, we were very happy with our map, and you don't really know, though, when you're drawing this, is this really going to perform the way you drew it? And it's only until an election do you know. Just to show the map a different way with bars, red and then blue, D, and purple competitive. I think it's a pretty symmetrical map. So people will say, well, you're supposed to create competitive districts. And the Democrats weren't real happy with us in that they felt like we could have drawn a 4th competitive district. We didn't draw enough. And I can appreciate that. But it's also, we have these other criteria. You can't favor competitiveness over the other ones, but you can't favor communities of interest over other ones. So everything has to be weighed equally to the extent practicable. And that's really, and then it's a judgment call. And so you try to make the best decisions you can based on the input you receive from the public and the numbers. And so really, I felt like at the end of the day, if both sides are unhappy, we did a good job. And so that's kind of what happened. And so here's the legislative district map. We go through the exact same process that we did with congressional. It's way harder because you're drawing 30 districts, and 10 of those ended up being majority-minority district to comply with Voting Rights Act. And you can see it's carved up substantially based on all the criteria. And I think each of those legislative districts have, it's the same number, 6.4 million, but divided by 30. And so I think the ideal population is 200 and something. I don't know the exact number, the exact population, but 215,000 or so. And this is what it looks like just partisan-wise. The RSDs aren't. There's more safe Republican seats than Democratic. And some competitive ones, not as many, but again, there's only so far you can go with this in terms of drawing these lines and trying to make things fair. So yes.
Did it make a difference as far as the outcome of the next elections, as far as number of representatives in Congress that were Republican or Democratic? Did it make any significant changes?
It did. So
and which way did it go?
One of the big things that it did is it removed the supermajority of Republican control of the state Senate. Remember, it was 21-9. I can't remember what the actual number came out to be in the 2012 election, but it was around, it was more in balance again. There's still more R's than D's, but they don't have a supermajority. So things like that were good. It brought that back. I'm going to show you the results electionally in a minute.
Oh, okay.
There's other results too, just of all the opportunities that people had to be a part of the process, and that's just some of the statistics that were out there. it was very encouraging, frankly, that many people got involved. So here's the results, because as I said, until you go through an election, how did you really do? So 4 safe R seats, remember, 2 safety seats and 3 competitive is what we drew. In 2012, the Democrats swept all 3 of the competitive seats. One race, the CD2 race down in Gabby Gifford's old district, which is the district where I live.
Yeah.
It took a lot longer to call, and it was only a 2,400 vote difference. But I was actually kind of, at that point, I thought, oh, everybody's gonna go crazy and say, see, we were right. She gamed the system so that the Democrats would win everything. And I was actually kind of glad when 2014 came about, when the Republicans actually won back CD2. It was only by 161 votes.
Wow.
So CD2 is the most competitive district in the nation. When your vote, I mean, it really shows how much your vote matters when 161 decides the election. So it's, and Arizona's recognized as having competitive districts. So even though we only have 3 out of, they said 72, some say it's as low as 35. There aren't many competitive swing districts left, sadly, and I think that's a detriment to our democracy. And so to the extent we can have competitive districts, I like them. In 2016, the Republicans retained control of CD2. So now the delegation is 5R and 4D. So really it's kind of performed the way we drew the map, which I was glad about. Legislative district, there's a lot more Rs. So yeah, there's the number, 17 Rs down from 21 when the commission took over, and 13 Ds in House 34 and 26. Arizona's a red state. You know, there's more Republicans here, and that's fine. And we can only draw lines, you know, to the extent practicable, and you don't want to gerrymander in such a way that is so crazy that you end up with earmuff districts and all of that. We also have that Voting Rights Act. So this is where, because of the Voting Rights Act, you have to have a certain number of minority voters in those majority-minority districts that we drew. Those minority voters tend to be Democrats. That's just the reality. Democrats are concentrated in those 2 districts. What could change is now that the commission doesn't have to comply with Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act because of that Shelby County decision, there's more Democrats to free up to be put in other parts of the state. They don't have to, I mean, assuming, you know, they're not too far away from the border lines. But that's what's interesting, is maybe it will actually enhance competitiveness now that we don't have to comply with the Voting Rights Act in terms of Section 5 pre-clearance. You still have to comply with Voting Rights Act, and there's other things that have to be considered. You still can't pack and crack people and divide them unnecessarily, but freeing up a commission to draw lines without Section 5 is going to be, it's a different ballgame. And so actually, maybe they'll be able to draw more competitive districts next time. We'll see. Yes?
I really enjoyed your presentation because it shows a real depth of experience and knowledge on the topic. Well, and you've only been at it since 2011.
Yeah, I'm a novice, but
and
go
the
ahead.
other commission members are equally now much more informed.
Yeah.
The next round, beginning in 2021, starts with all new people.
Right.
Do you have anything in place that's going to give them the benefit of the experience gained in this round?
It's a great question, and it's one we talked about as a commission. Like, is there a book we could write, like a primer, and here's a how-to, and don't do this, we made this mistake? All we can try to do is kind of write up lessons learned and do things like this, have forums like this, discussions where we can actually express openly, because while we were under litigation, I really didn't feel comfortable talking about, frankly, anything, and now that that's all over with, we can now start to look back and say, how could we do this better, and what can the next commission learn from our mistakes, and things like that. So I do think in the next 2 years is the time to really start to do that. And also, we can go to public comment ourselves next time if we want to, any of the commissioners, and say, hey, just want to put on the record that, you know, we did X, Y, and Z, and we think you should do something differently, or this worked really well, or this didn't. So there are ways to kind of get the word out. But I think the more opportunities we have like this to talk, the better. I think any future commission, there are things to learn from it.
But they should all sit through a session.
Yeah.
Or more than one.
Yeah, yeah, there's a lot to it. These are just more results, but that last one is really the key. Independent redistricting is preserved thanks to the Supreme Court. It's really thanks to the Arizona legislature, because they're the ones who sued us and ended up losing that case. And it's always be careful what you wish for. So we already talked about litigation happens. We talked about the Shelby County decision. That's the thing that gutted Section 5, which will change things for the next commission. But we had to comply with it, so it'll be different next time. This was that case, the Arizona State Legislature versus the IRC. The oral arguments were March 2nd of 2015, if anybody followed them. We were fortunate, my husband and I, to get to go and hear those at the Supreme Court. It was super interesting to do that. I've never done that before. And 14 amicus briefs filed on behalf of the IRC. And as I mentioned, many Republicans from across the nation filed amicus briefs, governors of states, of Republican states. So people, I think, it makes sense. I think independent redistricting, when you hear more about it, I think people think, yeah, that's a fair way to go. Now, the devil's in the details, and you got to figure out the best way to compose the commission and choose them, the commissioners, and all of that. But at the end of the day, it's better than having people in a back room that you don't see draw the lines, because they're going to draw lines that protect their power. Yeah. And that's just human nature, whether it's an R or a D or an I. So, yes?
So that brings up my question of, in the beginning, when you first got together, was there a lot of rancor between, and then did it improve as the years went by?
It was the opposite, actually. There wasn't a lot of rancor in the beginning. I think everybody, none of us knew each other. I think actually a Republican and a Democratic commissioner, Linda McNulty and Rick Sturz, are both from Pima County, and they knew each other because their children went to the same school. They didn't socialize, but knew of each other. That was it. But none of us knew each other beyond that, and so I think everybody kind of came in with an open mind and thought, this will be interesting. And, I thought we would all band together as a unit and everyone would hate us, but that we would all be just kind of, hunkered down and trying to do the best job we could. By the end, there was definitely a split in the commission because there were some commissioners who sided with the legislature, frankly. They wanted the legislature to win. So, then it's a different dynamic. So, yeah, it was. But this was super cool, this statement, this from Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who wrote the majority opinion for that case. The people themselves are the originating source of all powers of government. And who can argue with that? I mean, I just think that's it. And so that's why we get to have independent redistricting. Another case went to the U.S. Supreme Court. Do I need to end? Okay, I'll wrap it up. Second Supreme Court case. Fortunately, this wasn't a split court. We had a unanimous decision out of them. Some Republican voters claimed that we diluted their votes intentionally to help Democrats on the legislative district map. The court ruled in our favor and said that they read our record, actually, went through our process and said, well, now the commission actually didn't do that. So that was really good. And Justice Breyer wrote the majority opinion on that, but again, it was unanimous. So we finally got through all of our litigation this year because the last case was this spring, Leach versus IRC, and that was brought in state court. But the judge ended up granting summary judgment on the case in March. It's throughout the whole case, so it was great. So some lessons learned for all of you good government people to just keep in mind. Having a healthy and courageous third branch of government and fourth estate, meaning the press, is really important. It was key to us, and we had all kinds of Republicans, moderate Republicans in the state, come to our defense, and really that's you know, they're unsung heroes in this, because people saw what was happening and came to our defense, and that was hugely important. And to the extent we can be shielded from outside forces, all the better. How you do that, I don't know, but it needs to happen. And then are there adjustments that make sense? We talked about these already essentially, but those 2018 numbers are brand new, and you can see that it says 34.01 other, but if you add the I think it's 1.1% when you add the Greens and the Independent Libertarians together, it surpasses then the Republican registration in the state. So it's really changed a lot since Prop 106 passed. Will SCOTUS have endorsed this mathematical measure called efficiency gap, or some other measure that gets presented in the next couple of years on partisan gerrymandering to limit it? That could change things dramatically for the next commission. How will Shelby County decision impact things? Will it be adequately funded? It's always a question mark. And who's going to be part of the next IRC? So that's where I hope that you guys will get the word out. You know that quote, and very famous. And I modified it for my use to just say, I had one, and he was hugely supportive and helpful. And I would recommend, that is something I would tell the next commission, is get a dog. Each of you should have one, so that, and a good husband who is supportive, or wife, or significant other. And that's it. So thank you.